right, here we are for week 8 of the Vikings, and it's just after spring break, at least this semester that we're taping. It's right after spring break. And the midterm, which you're all in the midst of taking right now. And many of you have turned in, or you should have by now, turned in your project proposals for your term paper. And in fact, I think they've all been turned in, and most of them have been graded at this point. So if you haven't turned in your project proposal, get in touch with us immediately and let us know. A couple of issues came up on the project proposal, and maybe some of the students in the class here or those on our off-campus sites in Sugar Land and Katy can answer the question, what is the difference between primary and secondary sources? Okay, does everybody know the difference between primary and secondary sources? What's a primary source? Yeah.
Primary sources are things from the time period or actual writings.
His mic is not working, I think. All right. Try that one.
Primary sources are things from the time or actual writings from people that you're doing a project about. Secondary sources are other people who've done research.
Yeah, other people like modern people. Can anybody else give an example of a primary source? What is a primary source? Give an example of one.
Actual records of the time.
Actual records of the time, like
records,
laws, poetry. Yeah, that's an excellent example. Poetry of the time. Okay, what is an example of a secondary source? Anybody? Give an example of a secondary source. Yeah.
Like Jenny Dawkins.
Oops.
Jenny Dawkins or the Viking textbook.
Yeah, the textbook or Jenny Dawkins, which is a modern study. And she used primary sources in her study, but her study is a secondary source because she's a modern author. Okay, you might also look at primary sources like archaeological records, archaeological digs, and I've used a lot of archaeological examples here when I've given the lectures and showed you objects from the time. Something like the Bayeux tapestry or many of the tapestries that actually the Vikings did, that would be a primary source as well. And so any object or piece of writing or drawing or piece of art that came from the time of the Vikings is a primary source. Anything written in modern times or after Viking times, really modern times, is a secondary source. Yeah.
Sagas, would they be considered their primary sources, correct? Even though they're usually written 200 to 300 years later?
Yeah, and they're semi-primary sources. You have to be really careful with the sagas because they're not written at exactly the time. They're probably based on oral history from the time we're studying, but you have to use them with a grain of salt and realize that they've been written at a later time and make allowances for that.
But runestones would be considered a primary source.
Yes, runestones would be absolutely primary sources. Okay, so yeah, question.
Is it necessary that we use secondary sources? Most of my sources were primary.
No, you don't have to use any secondary sources. I mean, if you did, you would be doing real historical digging if you only used primary sources. It's much harder to do it that way because you have absolutely no guide, but that's what historians do, many of them. It sort of depends, you know, in some fields like Roman history and Greek history and some medieval history, the sources have been known for such a long time that the same sources are used over and over again, and in that case you do want to refer to secondary sources and how major historians have interpreted those sources. But if you're using sources that nobody's ever used before, I mean, obviously there aren't any secondary sources to use, and there are plenty of things like that, actually, that have never been interpreted. Jenny Dawkins' book is one example of that because she discussed sources on women, which really haven't been used very much. and haven't been done very much. Women and children haven't been looked at very much in the Viking Age. So, as with other history. Okay, any more questions on your projects? Because I think April 27th is the date. Libby, is that April 27th the date they're due? Well, I mean, that would be for this class. 25th, okay, that's for this class only, but those of you watching on TV, check your syllabus for the actual date that it's due. But that's going to come up in a month and a half before we know it. So if you have any questions about your project, bring them to class and ask, because chances are if you have a question, somebody else has the same question. So that it's good to answer them. Okay, well, now that we have spent the entire first half of the semester looking at Viking culture and Viking society and Viking artifacts and the way the Vikings lived and their religion and all of that, we're really familiar with Viking life and lifestyle now. Now we're going to leap into the world of Viking exploration and see where they went and what they did with this culture that we've already studied. And so we're going to start tonight by looking at Viking ships and weapons. We're going to look at the technology that allowed them to break out of Scandinavia, and then we'll do that in the first half of the class tonight, and then in the second half we're going to look at the first Viking invasions, the reasons why they left Scandinavia and where they went right at first, and how it eventually, well, the rest of the course will look at how it snowballed and turned into a pretty much almost a conquest of the northern hemisphere as far as they could reach. So we're going to look first at Viking ships and weapons, and then at the first Viking invasions. And as usual, the notes for this are on the WebCT site so that you can download them to look at while you're hearing the lecture. Okay, the Vikings went almost everywhere in the northern hemisphere that was convenient for them to go to. They went both to the east, to Russia, and they went to the west, across the Atlantic to Greenland and North America. And so there's just huge explosion in all directions, east, south. They even went north, actually. They were first limited to settlement in the southern area, and during the Viking Age from 750 to about 1150, they actually expanded their living space to the north and then to the west and to the south. They went around in this area to the Mediterranean. So we have this enormous explosion of the Vikings out of this area. Okay. And what have I done? I have put these maps in the wrong place. Let me just, okay. Excuse me. Sorry, I didn't mean to do this. All right. Okay, there were precursors to the Viking ships in 5200 to 4200 BC, when the Vikings were using essentially expanded dugouts, and they were hollowed out logs, and those were the first Viking ships, and we've already looked at some of those ships. Possibly they used them as trading vessels because they had hearths fore and aft. That meant that they traveled long distances and they actually cooked on the boats. I'm going to go through some of the finds of these boats in order that they have been found, and those of you who are studying Viking ships can possibly relate to these different kinds of ships that they found. The Hjortspring boat is the earliest. It was found about 350 BC, and it's a war canoe made of lime wood like the Viking shields. And this boat was hollowed out with a central plank like the earliest boats, and it had a central rib. It was tied together with bast, which is a kind of jute cordage. Jute is, of course, hemp that you make rope from, and so it was tied together with cords, and there was no iron. There were no iron rivets or anything to tie it together. The joints were sewn together with the ropes. It was propelled with paddles, not oars, and of course there were no sails on this very earliest boat that we found. Now, the Nydam boat, which was only about which was actually 600 years later, 320 AD, the Nydam boat was one of 3 found in a bog, and in 600 years they had made enormous progress in their ship technology. Actually, 3 were found in a bog. A bog is a very damp, swampy place where it's buried in mud and water, which preserves it. And these 3 boats that were found, one made of oak, one made of pine, and one made of lime wood, give us 3 excellent examples of the kinds of ships that they were building in about 320 AD. Only the Nydam oak boat survived the Danish-Prussian War in 1864, and so we just have that one boat that we can look at now. Okay, here is time when the earliest boat, we were looking at 5000 BC, when the earliest Indo-Europeans went into Scandinavia, and earliest boat dated from that time of the very earliest migrations. And here are some boats. These are from the Bayeux Tapestry, a primary source for the Normans, right? And which has pictures of boats that are very Viking. And so you can see exactly how these boats are made. And when I show you the boats, you're going to say, wow, those look just like the boats in the Bayeux Tapestry. They're exactly like them. And even though these are Norman boats, they look very Viking. And here is an early rock carving of one of those boats that is just rowed without a sail. Here they have oars, whereas the earliest one had only paddles. And then here is the Nydam boat, and look at it. Isn't that very like those boats in the Bayeux Tapestry? You can see it's clinker built with the rows of the planking down the side, and they're all curved inward in that same way. And here you have a central plank down the middle with seats for rowing. And this is a rudder. The Vikings had their rudder on the side. And it used to be thought that this would be a very inefficient rudder, that you couldn't really steer the boat with that kind of a rudder on the side, but actually you can. And the replicas, the modern replicas that have been built, and experienced sailors who sail them across the Atlantic say that once you learn how to manipulate it, it's a perfectly functional rudder and it works perfectly well in order to sail these boats. So this is the Nydam boat. And it's relatively small, as you can see. It was 79 feet long, and we can date it by dendro. Does anybody know what dendrochronology is? Yeah.
That's using trees, the tree sample, like the roots of trees. You date them, you find out how old the things around the trees are.
Yeah, you can cut it down and you can count the rings, and you can see the pattern. Some will be wider and some will be narrower according to how much water the tree got that year, or what kind of a season it was. And it'll have a pattern, and you can look at the wood on the planking of the boat and match it to tree rings that are old enough, and you can see how old they are, and that's called dendrochronology. I think there's one caveat with dendrochronology. I think that the tree rings you compare them to have to be from that area, don't you think? I mean, I'm really suspicious when they compare, when people compare European finds to the redwoods in California, for example. I mean, I don't think that applies. You have to do it with a local tree. But this ship was 79 feet long, and it was much stronger than the Hjortspring boat. It was assembled with iron rivets this time, so now 600 years later we see iron rivets being used, but it was also sewn in the same way that the Hjortspring boat was. It's a parallel development to the Hjortspring boat that would lead to Viking ships. Sewn boats were still made in 1900 Finland, so sewing the boats together with rope was an old technology that still lasted with the neighbors of the Vikings in Finland, but the Vikings advanced far beyond that. The Needham boat was built entirely of oak, and it was built of 5 huge planks that made up the sides. And remember, it's 79 feet long. The ribs were made of curved oak, and there were trees, that they had enough trees at that time to go in the forest and actually find trees that were the right shape in order to have a tree that was shaped exactly right for cutting the planks for their boat. And they would find them naturally shaped so they didn't have to cut them in half. And there were enough tall trees still existing to get a plank that would be 79 feet long, that would be for the whole side of the ship. The grain ran with the ribs, and that made it much stronger. It was the first purely rowing vessel with no mast or sail, and oarlocks were carved from forked limbs. The next boat in the series is the Sutton Hoo vessel from about 630 A.D., and this is an archaeological find unearthed in East Anglia in England, and it was the burial ship of possibly an Anglo-Saxon king or possibly a king from northern Denmark, because that's where the Angles came from, to England in northern Denmark, and it was clearly a royal ship because of all the implements that were found with it. Okay, here is one of those. Here is a natural knee, a natural branch that could be used if you wanted a curved kind of plank. You could find a tree that was naturally shaped that way. The Sutton Hoo ship was 88 feet long and may have had a mast and sail because it had a large, powerful rudder, and there were 9 planks on each side, and the joints were scarfed together. Okay, scarfing, I'm going to show you a picture of scarfing in a minute. Scarfing is when you cut both of the joints so that they fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, and then you clamp them together with either iron or wooden pegs, but they're fitted very carefully together. And I'll show you a picture in a moment of that. Here it is, right here. Here is scarfing, okay, so that you cut this one, and the ones I've seen are cut thicker than that actually, but you cut them to fit together and then hook them together with pegs, okay. We'll look at that again in a minute. The craft of shipbuilding was very complex, and it used a lot of resources. They used, of course, the woods that were native to the northern area: pine, white oak, and ash, and sometimes spruce. White oak is particularly good because you can bend it using steam. If you can't find a particular tree trunk that's curved the way you want it, you can use white oak and bend it by using steam, and when it's green, it's very flexible. Oak is also very resistant to rot. Ash is also workable and resistant to decay, and it has the advantage in these Viking ships of being very light. So often the frames and the thwarts and the oars were made out of ash, and so they would use multiple woods in a ship according to the purposes and the qualities of the wood. Now, spruce was usually used for the spars and the masts, and I'm not sure what the advantages of spruce are. Does anyone know woods in particular? Have any idea why spruce would be particularly good? Does it have more resin in it or something? I don't know why I'm thinking it does. No, okay. Well, they use spruce for the spars and the masts. The trees had to be felled, and then the bark had to be removed, and then the tree had to be split in half and then in quarters. Actually, pardon my typos here. The tree was split in half and then into quarters. And then the quarters were split into planks just over an inch thick with radial splitting, so that you would have, for example, here would be the tree. You would split it in half. This would be looking at it from the trunk, right, from the top of the trunk. Split it in half and then split it in corners, and then this is how they would cut the planks, with radial splitting, okay. so that your planks would taper, right? Okay, and here is the rib of the boat that shows a rib with a seat attached that would then be put into the interior of the boat. The ribs, of course, would strengthen it, and it would be attached at the edge here. And here is the fastening of the stem to the bottom plank here, and then here is a diagram of how the boards join the ribs right here with these little rivets along the side. And here's an oar. Okay, I'm not sure what that is. These are oar holes of red pine and an oar hole. This is the oar hole of the Nydam boat, and so that the oars would go right through here, and they would take a naturally notched piece of wood to make that oar hole, and this one they made an actual hole in the Nydam boat. And here you can see the inside of one of the stems, and you can see the central stem down here and these ribs strengthening it from each side in the bottom of the ship. The master shipbuilder himself carved the stems and the keel with an axe and an adze, and refined them with hatchets and chisels and a mallet. The seams were sealed where the planks met, and usually they would seal them with pitch, or they would seal them with cloth that they would stuff in there. The planks were then riveted together with iron rivets, and as the planking progressed, natural ribs were lashed in place. Flexibility was the key to the Viking ship design. It had a very light and strong hull. It had a sheer strake pierced with oar ports and a gunwale, or a reinforcing strip, that doubled as a shield rail along the edges. The Oseberg ship, dating from about 800 AD, was excavated in 1905 in Norway. And this was the next step in shipbuilding. It was rigged for a square sail, and it could also be rowed, and it had 30 oars, which was an enormous amount of oars. It had 12 narrow planks along the side, and lashing made it flexible. And these are very light boats that would just, no matter how big they would just leap across the water. And actually the Vikings thought of their boats as living things. They gave them names, and they saw them as alive on the water. This is the Toon ship. It's a very ruinous one with oak logs or blocks, and we can see the remnants of these ships. This was an earlier one. Okay, here are the rivets, the iron rivets that they would use, or clinch nails, to rivet it together. And here is a picture of the square-rigged sail that they would have on a Viking ship in this rune stone. We can see the shape of the ship we're familiar with, and the square-rigged sail. This is the Oseberg ship that is in Norway, and the Oseberg ship is a burial ship for a queen, as we saw before. It has this wonderful carving on it, and everything in it has this exquisite carving all over it. And you can see this 12 ribs going up, and you see there are no joints in these ribs. So this is the natural shape, or they bent them with steam so that they could go up like that in the shape. And this is the strake, or the rail on the side. This is a gigantic ship, and here you can see a bit of the inside. We saw the underside of the ship with those ribs, and then there would be a floor, of course, that would cover that, but the floorboards would be removable in case you had to bail water, that, you know, the waves break over the ship, and so they would have to bail the water out of the ship. And a big ship like this often would have lifeboats on it too, small lifeboats, or small boats of various kinds. Here's another ship at Oseberg, and here's a tent that would be built on top of it for shelter when you were sailing in the ship. And here you can see where the mast goes in this ship. This is in the same museum. The Oseberg ship was a cruising vessel, not for the open ocean, but it was ideal for the noblewoman buried in it. It was a very elegant luxury craft with all the carving and the luxury goods that were in it. But the Gokstad ship was the Viking craft. It was a highly versatile offshore workhorse from about 850 AD, and so it's really contemporary to the Oseberg ship. It was made entirely of oak with a displacement of 20.2 tons, and it had both sails and oars, 16 oars, about half as many as the Oseberg ship. So the Oseberg ship, it was in some sense a ceremonial ship and a luxury ship. This is a business ship. This was a Viking ship, that war horse and a workhorse. And then we have some examples of various kinds of ships. In the Skoldilev wrecks, wreck 1 is a Nar, and this was found in Roskilde. A Nar is a deep-hulled cargo ship, and it's made differently from a warship like the Gokstad ship. The Gokstad ship is light and of a shallow draft, so that it'll be faster and more efficient. And the Nar has a much deeper draft to the ship, and it can hold more cargo, and so it has a deeper hull. And this, of course, would be the vehicle of choice for trade or colonization. It had pine planking and an oak skeleton that made it less expensive than the Gokstad ship, and it had more bracing than the Oseberg or the Gokstad ship. It was a deep water cargo vessel, and it was also heavier because you wanted your warships to be lighter and your travel vessels to be lighter, but a cargo ship, it doesn't matter if it's heavier. The deck was dropped lower to hold more cargo. And so this is a Nar. A Nar is the cargo ship. Here is a Viking ship used. This is the Gokstad ship, in fact, and it was used for a burial. But you can see the planks along the side, and here's the rudder, and then here's the tent on top that was used for shelter when they traveled a long distance. Here is the sepulchral chamber. This is actually the burial chamber, but they would have, this is probably heavier than the tent they would have on board as they went along their way. And here is a shield right next to it, and we'll see more about the shields later. Okay, this is a model of a Viking ship, and this I took in Roskilde. Here you can see a very shallow drafted warship with a square sail, and behind it is a deep drafted Nar, the cargo ship, and you can see how the draft is different in the two ships. And this is one of the ships at Roskilde. What would you guess this is? Do you think this is a cargo ship or a warship? Anybody have a guess? What does it look like to you?
Looks like a warship. It's not that deep. It's kind of wider.
Yeah, it kind of looks like a warship. Does everybody agree it's probably a warship? Does it look more like a warship? How about this one back here? So you see they filled in with a wire kind of outline of the missing parts. What do you think about that one back there? Think that looks like a warship or a cargo ship?
Probably more of a cargo ship.
You think why do you think it's more of a cargo ship?
Well, from what little bit I can see, it looks like there's more planking to it. I gather that's a bowsprit that we're seeing. What little bit we can see in the picture.
Yeah.
Behind.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It looks like there's more. Looks like there's more planking. It looks like it's a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I agree.
At least from this angle.
Oh, okay, it does from my angle too, and thanks, Don, for the close-up. From here, looking at the picture, it looks like it is much deeper than this ship. This ship looks like it's got a much shallower draft. These ships are in the big ship museum in Roskilde, and they had a number of different kinds of them there. Here is the inside of that ship that we just saw in the background, and you can see here that it has a much deeper draft than the one we just saw. And my guess is this was a cargo ship. However, all the captions were in Danish, and so I was at a disadvantage in the museum. I have to learn Danish. Okay, and here, this also, to me, this looks like a cargo ship because it has such a deep draft. And here are the oarlocks, which are much more utilitarian. They're not fancy like some of the other ones we saw, the other oarlocks that were the fancy kind of natural-shaped tree branches. Skoldilev 5 was a small warship, slender and light, a perfect hit-and-run craft, mostly oak, and it only had 7 planks for side, the top 3 being of ash. Okay, why would the top 3 be of ash? I mean, what would you think when you find the top 3 are of ash? What is your conclusion? Larry, you look like you have an answer.
I'm thinking for fighting, the ash might be a little more resilient.
And it's lighter weight. So this is a smaller ship, and so it would be lighter. It only has 7 planks per side, and the top 3 are ash, so it would be much lighter and a swifter ship. The equipment that they had with the ships is also in these museums. These are primary sources, by the way, all of these ships and all of their equipment. The equipment they would have would be a gangplank and usually 3 lifeboats to the ship. Yeah?
And also, they wouldn't have to worry about the ash waterlogging so much because it would be above the water.
Oh, good, yeah, so that the ash wouldn't waterlog if it's above the water. Yeah, it would be less exposed to the water. That's a good point. So that the oak would be on the bottom and it would be less prone to being waterlogged. Okay, good. They would have 3 lifeboats on them, and they would have a bailing scoop and an iron anchor, a cauldron for cooking. And I can't imagine them making fires on the boats, but they apparently did. Or they made fires when they went ashore and cooked with the cauldron. I mean, we don't know. But my guess is I wouldn't make a fire on a wooden ship myself. I don't know if the Vikings did or not. What do you think?
Somewhere I remember that they built the fires in the cauldrons.
In the cauldrons?
Yeah.
Oh, you read that. Okay, now that would be a wonderful solution to make the fire. That would be a very good solution. I wouldn't make the fire on the wooden boat myself. But here we find these cauldrons, and so that's the evidence we have, unless we can find in the sagas some explanation of what they did. They also carried tents for shore use, but they would also use tents on the if they would be out at sea for a long time, they'd have a tent that they could use for shelter on the ship itself. The men slept on the deck in leather sleeping bags that were waterproofed with oil, and the floor planking in the ships could be removed to bail water and to identify leaks, which then could be repaired right on the ship. And so leather sleeping bags would be waterproof, and I imagine they were lined with fleece or wool or something of that sort to keep them warm and dry. They certainly, they protected their swords with fleece and wool on the inside of the scabbards. They must have used them in their sleeping bags as well. For navigation, how do they navigate? I mean, how do they get out in the open sea? Have you found some stuff, Larry, on their navigation?
Well, they use the stars, of course, all the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon. They also knew the seasons and how the stars changed by the seasons.
Yeah.
And they were also fairly well adapted to the different areas, or they knew that as they progressed on, like say they were going east, they knew that the stars changed with that, and they would account for that.
Well, they would study the skies very carefully, and they would be able to identify, they could do that at night. They could identify the stars and see what direction they were going. They also observed nature and animal behavior so that they would know when they were getting close to land, they could watch the behavior of ship or otters or seals or other animals and be able to know when they were close to land or when they were far away from land. And they would also, interestingly, carry birds along with them. And there's a famous story of ravens, and it makes you instantly think of Odin's 3 ravens. They would bring ravens with them and let them go and watch where the raven would fly, or doves, or whatever birds they might have. And if the raven flew back the other way that they came, then they would know they were still close to the land they had left. If the raven stayed where they were and refused to fly in any direction but landed on the boat. Then they knew they weren't close to land and they had to keep going. And if the raven flew ahead, then they went in that direction because that's where the land was. Yeah, comment?
I was just going to say they were very good at the seasonal fishing grounds, and they knew by
Yes.
season where the fishing grounds were, where the best fish could be, obtained, and it all worked within the scope of navigation and knowing, and relating the stars with the seasons and with where they were going, and so they were really, as far as that particular ocean was concerned, they knew everything about it.
They knew everything about the ocean. They had to. Living in Norway, I mean, what else could they do? They had to know where the fish went, and they had to know all the behavior, the natural behavior of animals and fish and whales and everything in order to see how to do it, and the tides and the weather and the wind direction, and they knew where the Gulf Stream was.
Right.
Yeah.
And I found a reference where they would, before they went Viking, they would go on a big fishing trip first. And they would first, they had ballast in the boat to keep it level. And they would use bricks and mortar and whatever stones, whatever they could find. And then as they collected the fish and air dried them or salt cured them, then they would put the fish in place of the ballast and then throw the ballast overboard. And so they had plenty of food to take them wherever they were going to go.
Very clever, very clever.
Very efficient.
Yeah.
It's a question, actually. Egil Saga, am I pronouncing that right? Or
Egil.
Egil Saga kind of refers to a lot of these journeys as, basically Skallagrim jumps in a boat and sails off to Iceland.
Yes.
I mean, was that really that easy, or was it a really treacherous journey?
At first it was treacherous, but very quickly they learned the pointing signs along the way, the weather signs and the wind directions and the currents, and they either wrote them down or memorized them, and so you would get directions. They could immediately reverse their path and go back where they came from because they were so used to memorizing the winds, the tides, the currents, the animal behaviors. They knew the sea so well they could retrace their path whichever way they came. And they knew, and so it was. The sea became like an easy highway, and Egil could just jump in his ship and go.
The saga itself, though, mentions specifically not a single person on the boat had ever been to Iceland. So I was wondering if maybe that was just phony.
Well, clearly they knew Iceland was there, so they must have gotten some navigational information. I mean, I can't imagine they just set off for it without finding somebody who had been there before, because they knew it was there, and so logic tells you they would have asked somebody, how do you get there? What are the directions? But of course, those are things they talked about. They were very practical. And so they would have taught the people who came from Iceland, who came back, the discoverers of Iceland would have reported exactly how to get there. And in fact, that's how Leif Erikson so-called discovered America. Somebody else went there first, and what Leif Erikson did was follow his directions to go back there. And so... he technically discovered America because he was the first one to set foot on it. And so he sort of parsed his sentences to say, I discovered it. Okay, well, they were geniuses at navigation. And let's look at some of the things they put on their ships, and then we'll look at some navigation aids. This is an iron chain found on the Gokstad ship, so that they would have chains for various uses on the ship. This is a chain for holding up the cooking pot. And so I don't know if the fire was inside or outside, but they had an iron chain for holding up the cooking pot. Here's the bronze handle of the kettle and an ornament. These are actually the lifeboats on the Gokstad ship had been chopped up and destroyed for some reason, and we don't know why they had destroyed all of the lifeboats, but what is left are the rowlocks where you would hook your oars in here to row on the lifeboats, and look how intricately carved they are. Isn't that amazing? I mean, even a simple utilitarian thing like an oarlock, they would carve very elaborately. And here are some more rowlocks from the Gokstad ship. That's all that was left from the lifeboats of it. Here is a bronze kettle found with the Gokstad ship. Wooden plates and wooden carved drinking cups were also found. And again, it wouldn't surprise me if they did make the fire in the kettle on the ship, if they didn't clean it out and cook with it, the kettle, when they reached land. I mean,
Dual purpose.
yeah, dual purpose. They were very practical. And here is a scoop for bailing, perfectly shaped for bailing out the water in the ship if you found a leak in the bottom. They also navigated by the stars, and they labeled 8 different directions, north, south, east, and west, obviously, but also in between northwest, south, southwest, and the same kind of directions that sailors use today. In fact, a lot of the terminology that the Vikings used passed into Anglo-Saxon or existed in Anglo-Saxon and has passed down to us in our language today. And one example is fore and aft. Those are Viking terms. And starboard. And what is the opposite of starboard? Port and starboard, yes, those are Viking terms. I'm not much of a sailor, sorry. But they, as Larry said, they navigated by the stars. They knew exactly how the stars were and what they were, and they labeled 8 different directions. They may have used a solar compass, which would have been a notched wheel with a hole in the center. And I kind of drew a picture of the wheel they might have used, and I'm not sure exactly how they would have used it. They must have pointed it at the North Star.
They would reference it to the sun, and then
Reference it to this. Yeah, could you use your mic and repeat that?
I'm sorry. They would use a hole to reference it with the sun and make a standard,
Yeah,
so they could compare each time they used it.
like a sundial.
Right.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it would work that way as a sundial. I was thinking of
The
pointing it
thing,
toward the North
caveat
Star.
would be
if
they would have to do it at the same time every day.
Yes, they'd have to do it at the same time every day. It would also have to be a sunny day.
Yeah.
But what if it was cloudy? They could even do it when it was cloudy. They had a stone, and it's feldspar. The modern stone is called feldspar. And what it is a sunstone. And what it does is capture the light of the sun. It polarizes sunlight to locate where the sun is, even on cloudy days. And so if you have this sunstone, you can tell the direction that you're sailing. So they had it all covered. Every base was covered. The rigging had a single square-rigged sail with sockets in the deck, which suggested a tacking spar. And a tacking spar is so you can turn the sail to go left, to make the boat go left or right. Right? Any sailors here who know about ships? Tacking is when you shift the sail, as far as I understand.
It makes it so you can sail against the wind.
Against the wind, right, exactly. Well, that's what I meant by turning the sail, yeah. Okay, I have sailed in a sailboat several times, but I know that's how you do it. Okay, they have this really ingenious technological thing called a sheaveless block. It's a kind of block and tackle to lift cargo on the boat, and it's kind of a system of pulleys that they can use to raise the anchor and to haul ships ashore. And it's very quickly dismantled with no moving parts, and you can store it flat. It is a very ingenious kind of block and tackle. That's the only way I can describe it. I'll show you a picture of one because one of my graduate students actually made a model of this. Okay, this is how I would visualize that they would do the wooden compass, and then they could use it like a sundial. That would really work if you put a stick through the middle, and you could use it as a sundial to tell your direction. Okay, here is the sail. It's a square sail, and here they've kind of furled it up in this way that looks like they might be tacking to me, so that they can vary it to go in the direction that they want to. This ship, this ship again is from the biotapestry because it has these really vivid illustrations of what
No, that's interesting because a triangular sail that the Mesopotamians came up with really enabled them to sail opposite of the wind because of the triangular shape. And that could have been what they were, that could have been what they were doing right there with that triangular shape.
Kind of furling it to make it triangular.
To get a better angle against the wind.
Yeah. I think that would work that way. And the biotapestry is a wonderful historical document because it puts all of these, it shows exactly how they did these things. Here is this sheaveless block, and it has these sort of flat wooden things that you use like a block and tackle to lift very heavy weights. And so you see that you can take it apart and it stores flat in a very compact package. But you can pull ships with this contraption, and it's like a lever and pulleys. And you can lift heavy weights, and you can raise the anchor, and you can actually pull ships with it. The sails were wool, and they were pieced together with long strips. They were often dyed in stripes or checkerboard. And in fact, the planks on the ship, as you saw in the biotapestry ships, they were painted bright colors, and the sails were bright colors. Norwegian wool was preferred because it had a very high lanolin content that made it waterproof. And this was extremely important that the wool be waterproof because wet wool is very heavy and it could make the ship turn over if your sail got soaked. And so the lanolin in the wool made the sail waterproof, and then the ship wouldn't take over. The clothing was wool and leather, which kept them warm and dry. And as we said last time, and I've been trying to research sweaters, and they apparently did not knit. They wove all their wool, and their clothes were woven. So they didn't have sweaters yet, but they probably had woven woolen clothes. Many of the explorers and discoverers were, in fact, exiles who went out and searched along their way. Okay, here is one of the biotapestry ships, and here you see the sail in that configuration again of a triangle and stripes on the sail. Here are the shields along the side, and then they painted the planks of the ship. Again, this is the biotapestry. Here's the lookout on climbing up on top, and here's that heavy anchor that they would have used to. They would have used that sheaveless block to raise and lower the ankle. And here are the anchor, and here are the oars that they're rowing and the rudder. Okay, there's a complete Viking ship, and here is a model of one with that square sail. And this sail is tilted so that it looks like you can turn it according to the wind in this model from Roskilde. Now, okay, we've looked at their ship technology, which allowed them to leave their homeland and go all over the North Atlantic. What about their weapons that allowed them to conquer? Well, here are some Viking warriors we've seen before with some typical weapons, and their most important weapons would have been a sword, which is in a sheath, and here is a javelin or a spear. Okay, and this guy has two spears in his hands, and here is one of these berserkers with a spear in his hand and a sword, and he's got a sword too. So this is their most common weapon. The blacksmith was the key workman among the Vikings who would make these weapons, and bog iron was their usual source of ore, because the deposits in the bogs renew themselves in 15 years. This is a sort of miraculous thing about the iron that collects in these bogs that are all over Scandinavia. A bog is like a marsh, and the iron collects together and it renews itself in the iron deposit. Through displacement of the minerals, yeah. And so they would dig up this bog iron and they would smelt it in a shaft furnace. And a shaft furnace is alternate layers of ore and hardwood charcoal that are put in a clay tower. And in the tower, the fire would be lit in the base. So you would have a sort of tower of clay like this. And then you would put alternate layers of ore and hardwood charcoal. And then you would light a fire at the base of it. And the bloom iron would be sweated out, and then it would be drained off. They'd have a drain that would drain it off, and then the bloom would be heated to 700 degrees to purify it, or the smith would hammer it and shape it into a bar as wrought iron. Okay, and they were very skilled blacksmiths. Here are the iron swords. This is one of my favorite pictures. All their weapons. Here's a sword, axe handles, and I don't know what that is, and arrowheads. Here's another axe handle here. The Viking smith would need an anvil, and he would use a metal anvil. It would have to be probably steel, a very prized object, but sometimes he would use a stone. He would also need bellows, which would blow on the fire to make it very hot, and he would need tongs to hold the steel, and hammers to pound the steel, and a file to smooth it out when he was done.
Usually a very large tree stump that was about 4 feet tall.
Yes, a very large tree stump to put the anvil on and to shape it on. And with these simple tools, and there aren't very many of them, the smith could manufacture anything needed in the community, and not just swords and weapons, but everything the community needed, from iron pots to pins to put in the boat, rivets. Sometimes the smith had to combine several pieces of iron together to make the blade of a sword, and so he could do that. He could weld together this iron, and then he could weld onto the iron sword a harder steel edge. Viking weapon edges were much tougher with this steel edge. They stayed sharp longer and capable of inflicting more wounds. Probably the axe was one of their most popular weapons, which sounds very gory. I mean, but axes, they were commonly carrying axes. There are more axes than anything when you look at the remains of everything. A skegox was a kind of bearded axe that was popular in the 8th century, but the hand axe was the most common, and it was exactly like a wood-cutting axe that they could use as a weapon or as a wood-cutting tool. The bradox, or broad axe, was first seen in the 900s, and this was clearly a weapon. It was huge. It could have a face of 18 inches with a 6-foot ash handle. It was a really enormous weapon. And so here are some axe heads. These are obviously small. I think this is a bearded axe, and they're obviously smaller wood-cutting axes, but then here are some huge ones. This is an iron axe, and here is, this looks like it has a steel side to it, and here are some more specialized axes. And here you can see the edge-on view to it so that it's tapered down here. And I believe this is a bearded axe, and this is a huge one found in a mound. Okay, and here is a highly decorated one inlaid with metal of silver mixed with gold, 1/2 its real size. And here are some more axes, huge axes. And again, these are very formidable weapons. And remember in the story of Egil that Egil beheaded 2 oxen with his axe that Eric Bloodaxe had sent him, and he treated it with contempt. Remember, he shattered it on a stone, implying that the axe was no good because he shattered it. Men named their axes after sea trolls, and so like the ships, they gave them personalities, and like their swords, they gave them personalities. St. Olaf's axe was named Hel after the Viking goddess of death, so that tells you what he did with his axe. So axes were a very popular weapon among the Vikings, and the Vikings are almost alone in having these axes as weapons. You don't find them in other places of Europe, the axe is so popular. Swords are more popular throughout Europe. Most of the swords were 32 inches long, and they were pattern welded and double-edged. The blades were often imported from Frankish territories, and the Franks, or the French, actually mass-produced these blades and then sent them up to Scandinavia, where the Vikings added the pommel and the hilt to them later. because they prized the Frankish blades. The hilt protected the hand, and the pommel offset the weight of the blade, so that I'll show you a hilt and a pommel in a minute. Down the center of the sword would be a blood groove, and maybe I'll just draw you a diagram here. Here's the sword, and then you would have a groove down the center on both sides of it if it's a double-edged sword, and this would be so that when you stab someone, a vacuum would not be created and the blood could pour out, because if a vacuum was created, you couldn't pull the sword out without that blood groove. That's what it's for. And then you have the pommel, which is a kind of hand guard, and then the pommel is to offset the weight of the blade, and the hilt protects the hand. Okay. The blood groove allowed air to enter the wound and eliminate the vacuum. The sheath, they would have a sheath for the sword, and it would be wooden, often covered in leather, and the fittings would be plated in gold or silver. Here is our sword again. This is a naked sword, and here is the hilt and the pommel that sort of offset the weight of the sword. Here is a whole collection of swords that I found on this wonderful blood red background in the National Museum of Copenhagen, and all these wonderful Viking swords that are found in abundance. Here is an especially neat one that has a gold and silver decorated pommel and hilt. And here are some more swords, some of them here. Can you see the blood groove there? Can you see that pretty well? That blood groove right down the middle of that sword, and there's one on this sword too. You can see the blood groove. Here are some highly decorated swords that are damascened, and here is a sheath that you would put the sword into. Again, here's a very elaborate sword and elaborately decorated pommels. Some more damascened swords with a blood groove, a very elaborate one there. And here are the elaborate patterns that you can see. And here's one with a Latin inscription for the name of the sword. The scabbard was lined on the inside with sheepskin with the nap downward to keep the sword in place. So you have sheepskin in the middle, and you put your sword down into it, and the nap is downward. It keeps the sword in place, and the lanolin in the sheep wool keeps the sword from rusting. Yeah, isn't that clever? And so it keeps the blade from rusting. And then the sheath was suspended from a leather belt. So this is a very efficient weapon, very well thought out. Another very popular weapon is the spear, and we saw in our warrior pictures numerous spears that they were holding. The largest is the throwing javelin, and it was a generic Germanic type common throughout northern Europe. And the javelin might be thrown with volleys of arrows at the start of a battle. So when they would start a battle, they would all throw their javelins, and the archers would shoot arrows, and that would soften up the enemy to get started. Olaf Tryggvason, and I spelled that wrong, sorry. Tryggvason could throw one javelin from each hand simultaneously, and it was considered brave to throw a javelin beyond the enemy lines and fight your way to it. And this must be why they put their names on them, so they could go back and retrieve their own javelin. Okay, here are some scabbards. Here are some hilts of our swords, some scabbards to put them in, very heavily decorated. And here is a lancer with a javelin. This is a Norman javelin thrower. Here's King William on his seal with his javelin and his sword. And I'm going to show you some javelins. You won't believe these guys. Here is a shaft 10 feet long on this javelin. They're wicked instruments. They're enormous. They're iron, of course. They're very heavy and huge. Here are some other huge ones, and usually the shaft of the javelin is 9 or 10 feet long. I mean, it is a really wicked implement. And these huge iron blades and javelin heads. Here is a photograph of some. You can get an idea of the size of these various javelin heads here. And here's another picture of them. And notice we've got grooves in these as well, so you can pull them out. Here's a bearded one with beard on it, and these have sort of feathery shapes on them. A hunting spear was more leaf-shaped and heavy for big game, but it could be used for warfare in a pinch. A thrusting spear was slightly different. It was used with a shield for pinpoint jabs. It was not thrown, but it was razor sharp. It's kind of a variation of a sword in a way that you jab with this spear. There's also something called a winged spear or Carolingian lance, and it had lugs halfway down to prevent it from becoming too deeply embedded in the target. And this was favored to hunt wild boar. And the lugs kept it from going in too deep so you couldn't pull it out and use it again. All the spearheads were mounted on an ash shaft 6 to 8 feet long, but some of them, as we saw, were 9 and 10 feet long. And here are some more. Look at this wicked little number up here with those barbs on it. That would kill a wild boar. And some of them are just enormously threatening and dangerous here. And look at these barbed spearheads or javelin heads. So they look like quite effective weapons. And here
Some
again,
of those look like whaling spikes.
yeah, they could easily be whaling spears. I think you're right, because of course if you were hunting something as big as a whale, you would want enormous javelins and spears. And likewise a wild boar or a wolf who could turn on your bear or a bear. And so they would need these for hunting. And so here is our lancer or spearman in William the Conqueror's army in Normandy. Archery was another kind of weapon. And of archery, of course, they had bows and arrows, and their bows were made of yew. Saxo Grammaticus speaks especially of the Norse being particularly good archers who used the bows in hunting and sport, but also in warfare. And I brought one volume of Saxo Grammaticus to show you here. It's been translated into English by Peter Fisher, and this is volume 1 with, of course, you recognize what this is on the front. Yes, this is the rune stone at Yelling, the Yelling stone. So Saxo Grammaticus writes the history of the Danes. And arrows are used for hunting and sports, but they're also used as archers in battle in lots of 40. So they would have 40 archers all shooting their arrows at one time with a rain of arrows raining down on their enemies as they attacked. The arrowheads were very specialized, from broad leaf-like blades for hunting to needle points for war. And the Vikings favored archers in naval engagements, and of course they would, because you can fire your arrows from one ship to another or the land, and they would be very effective weapons to use from a ship from far away. They would also set enemy ships alight with fire arrows, and then later this tactic was interestingly used by the Normans when they would attack cities or they would attack castles, and they would shoot burning arrows and burn them down. And so it could be used against ships or against cities. They left the feathers pointed, and usually they used goose feathers dyed blue as the weights on the end of the arrow to make them fly straight. That's what feathers are for. Yeah.
Where was the blue dye from?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where they would get the blue dye from. The purple dye is from mollusks. I don't know where they would get the blue dye from. I'll see if I can find that out for you. Well, here is a Norman archer, and he would have looked very much like the Viking archers, because the Normans look very much like the Vikings. He has his bow and his arrows. We can't see the feathers, but we can see his quiver that he would carry his arrows in. And here are some bows. They aren't bent, but they have the notches at the end, if you can see the notches where you put the string. And here is the little notch where you would put the string that would be on the end. Here is part of the arrow shaft, and they would of course carve a message in runes on it. Fly straight, little one. or something of that sort. And then here is an arrow shaft. This would be wooden, and then this would be iron on the end. And here's the arrow shaft with the owner's mark in its real size. And here is an arrow point of iron. And the arrow points would have been much smaller. And look at these wicked little beauties here. These look very wicked, the way they're twisted like that, these arrowheads. Here are some quivers. This is a wooden quiver. And here is a sort of flat-shaped quiver. And then this is the bronze mounting for a wooden quiver. This is a fragment of a quiver. And here is our Norman archer again with all his equipment. They used horses, but they didn't take them on raiding parties. Rather, they got on their ships and went where they were going, and then they stole whatever horses they needed from the local people. If they had to, they bought them, but they preferred to steal them, of course. The Scandinavian breed of horses was much smaller and more compact than the continental horses, but then one reason for this was because on the continent, in France and Germany, they had been breeding horses for several generations, and they were deliberately breeding bigger horses. And so the Scandinavians had not yet caught onto that yet, because they weren't fighting on horseback, whereas the Continentals were fighting on horseback. However, the Vikings had a horseshoe quite early, a kind of ice shoe for icy roads, and so they may have anticipated the continent in the shoes for their horses. The Vikings didn't usually fight on horseback, but rather they rode them or traveled by cart and wagon, but they never fought on horseback, whereas the Continentals did fight on horseback. They fought with shields, and the shields were made of lime wood, about 1/2 to 3/4 inches thick all around, and they had a domed iron boss in the center that covered the grip. The grip on the back was an iron bar that was riveted on the back, and it would be wrapped in leather or wood to absorb the vibration, because the shield they put it up to fend off the blow from a sword or a javelin or an axe, and so they needed to cushion that vibration. The edge of the shield was reinforced with leather or occasionally iron, but they never made the whole shield out of iron. Why do you think they never made iron shields?
The weight.
The weight, it would be far too heavy to have an iron shield, so they made it out of wood and covered it with leather or some other thing. Okay, here is a Viking horse and a rider. This was in the National Museum at Copenhagen again. And here is a horse and a cart on this runestone, which they would have favored for traveling. Here is a shield from the Gokstad ship. All their ships were round with a kind of leather edge. They would be ash wood, and then they would have this boss in the center. And on the back of that shield would be a grip like this that would go right behind that boss on the center. And then here is what the bosses would look like. It could look like this. It's kind of raised. Here is another grip with a handle. And here's a shield boss of iron, and here's a very decorated shield boss. And here are some shields from the museum at Copenhagen. Some of them would be covered with a very thin coating of metal, so that it would be hard, but it would be very thin. It's like plating it or leaf like gold leaf or silver leaf that would cover it. So here are some actual shields, and you can get an idea of the size of those shields. Often they were painted, and the Gokstad shields were divided into fours and painted yellow and black. And I sort of imagine what they look like. I didn't have a picture in my book, but I would imagine that they would be done like this with yellow and black. Say this is yellow and this would be black, because it kind of foretells heraldry, that heraldry grows out of the patterns that they put on their shields later in England. Often the shields were displayed on the gunwales of ships when entering the harbor or on parade, but usually not on voyages. They were put there. But you had read, Larry, that they did use them on voyages. They used them as splash
Splash guards in high
guards.
seas.
Yeah, okay. That's a possibility. Again, we don't really have the written evidence. We have to guess as to what they did. They also wore chainmail, which was fairly uniform all over Northern Europe, and this was a tunic with half sleeves that ended at mid-thigh. What it is, it's like an iron sweater, and it's very heavy, and it's knitted together with little rings of iron. You know, it's amazing they couldn't figure out how to knit if they could make shields, if they could make chainmail out of links of iron. But it protected against slashing sword cuts and smaller axes, but not against spears and large axes or arrows. So it was sort of protective. But they never used solid metal armor because it was too heavy. I mean, this chain link mail is very, very heavy. And so I can't imagine wearing plate armor. They also routinely wore helmets, which were made from forged iron plates riveted together and padded inside with cloth, leather, or horsehair. They had no chin straps, but a fine helmet was a sign of status and power. And of course they had to pad them inside, because if you took a sword blow to the helmet, you wouldn't want your head ringing with the bell-like tone of it.
Would still transfer and still be just as effective if they didn't pad it.
Yeah, oh well, yeah, it would. If they didn't pad it, they could be hurt by the blow of the sword. Well, here again is a model of a Viking ship with the shields along the side. This is again at Roskilde, and you can see the photographer in the glass there. That was me. But here is a picture of this sort of chain link mail. It's like a metal sweater, and usually there's a hood that goes over their head as well that they would have. And here is a bit of a close-up of this chain link mail. You can see what it looks like. It's very heavy. And here is a very close-up. You can see what the chain link mail looks like. And maybe with this one, this is a different one, you can get a little different perspective on how the chain link mail is constructed. Okay, and here are the helmets, and notice that these Normans, the only pictures I could find of helmets were these Normans, and there are 4 different types of helmets, but I only found the Norman helmet with the nose guard. Another type of helmet would be just conical like this without a nose guard that the Vikings would have used. This one over here has a very short nose guard, so it would be kind of like that. Notice that his chain link mail has a hood on it over his head as well to protect him. And this is inaccurate. They've got it split in the side. Actually, this is chain link mail. This is, again, from the biotapestry. It's split down the center so they could ride their horses. So that would have been inaccurate. And here is our Norman archer again with a helmet. There were 4 types of helmets: conical, domed, conical with a nasal, and domed with goggles. But the most common was the conical with a nasal. They fought a number of different types of battles in the saga warfare. It was small scale, mainly hall burning, where they would encircle the hall and lock the doors and set fire to it and kill anyone who ran out. That was a favorite battle tactic. They often had feuds, which would be a vendetta seeking revenge for the death of a family member or a large-scale theft, and these feuds often lasted for years. Larger battles would be royal household actions where the king or a jarl would send out his housecarls, his herd, and to keep the nobles in check, and they would be like a police force to battle against rebellious nobles. And finally, the largest battle of all would be a royal army campaign, a large-scale operation that would be a huge army invading foreign nations. And here is a very famous scene from the biotapestry, and these are Normans riding their horses into battle in the continental way, because the Normans had adopted continental tactics. Here are the helmets with the nasal. This is a very famous scene of William the Conqueror raising his helmet when the Normans wheeled and ran away and said, "Wait, wait, I'm alive." Come back. Yeah.
Was a scale mail ever used, or is that also a myth?
I think the Romans had a kind of scale mail, but I don't know if they didn't use it normally, and I didn't find any in the archaeological remains I had. It was all chain link mail. That was the preferred kind. The Romans used a kind of scale mail, though. Good question. They used a tactic like a square, sort of like a Greek phalanx, and they used a swine wedge formation to win the victory. The strand hog was an exploitive conflict, and they would have resupply raids to furnish the ships at sea, campaigns to raid monasteries, slaving runs into Ireland, and men usually were gathered from one region for each raiding party or each army so that they were all related to each other. The Vikings preferred to fight each other in sea battles to protect the crops and the farms, and they would conduct the sea battles like a land war. Here is a quote. Well, I think I'll leave this quote until after our break because we're almost out of time. Let's take 15 minutes, and when we come back, we'll end with this quote.